Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today we have John Titus from Best Evidence to come on and talk about the Fed and maybe Sullivan and Cromwell. How are you today, John?
I'm great, Darren. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. So I have a few questions for you. Can you describe the going direct plan in Jackson Hole 2019 and how that changed how the Fed implements QE?
Yeah, so that Jackson Hole is the annual meeting hosted by the Kansas City Federal Reserve, which is one of the 12 districts of the Federal Reserve. And every year they host this meeting of monetary and financial bigwigs. And in 2019, they held it around August 22nd. And at that meeting, a big company called BlackRock, I'm sure you've heard of it, they have $10 trillion in assets. BlackRock presented a plan called, I think it was called Dealing with the Next Downturn, but it colloquially became known as the Going Direct Reset. And the reason for that is the plan said, and keep in mind, this is August of 2019, so there's no repo crisis yet. That's a month off. And there's no pandemic yet. That's 4 months off or so. And in the plan, BlackRock says to the Fed and to other central banks around the world, you're going to have another downturn. It's inevitable. And when you do, you're out of room to deal with the crisis through conventional monetary policy, meaning you've already lowered interest rates down to zero. You're going to need a new trick. And what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to find a way to get public money, meaning the reserves, because it's really the public authority that the Fed has to gin up and create new money in the form of reserves. You're going to need to find a way to get the public money into private hands. And up until that time, the Fed hadn't really done that in any significant volume. And after that happened, after that plan was presented by BlackRock, the Fed, sure enough, there's a repo crisis and then later a much bigger crisis in the form of a pandemic. And really in March of 2020, that's when the Fed goes just ballistic, buying new treasuries and buying new mortgage-backed securities. But this time it buys them from non-banks. And that's a big deal. It buys all of them from non-banks. And that's a big deal because if they're buying a bond from you or me, a non-bank, or from a hedge fund, which is a non-bank, or a retirement fund, which is a non-bank, it's tricky because non-banks don't have accounts at the Fed and they can't accept reserves. So if you want to sell $1 billion bond, the Feds could offer you $1 billion for that bond. It's not going to do you any good because you don't have an account at the Fed. $1 billion in reserves does you no good. So what the Fed does is it says, okay, well, what we'll do, Darren, is you transfer your bond to us, and in order to pay you, what we'll do is we'll transfer $1 billion in reserves to whatever bank you bank at. And when your bank gets the $1 billion in reserves, it leaves your bank in a position where it now has an imbalance on its balance sheet. It's got $1 billion of new assets, but doesn't have $1 billion in new liabilities. And that's where you come in. That's how you get paid. The bank will then create a $1 billion account in your name, which is a liability to a commercial bank. That's just how our banking system works. Legally, a banking account, a checking account at a bank is an IOU. And so now with that new $1 billion account in your name, the bank's balance sheet balances out. And what's happened, the net effect of that transaction is you have $1 billion in new reserves created, which is really what everybody concentrates on when they look at the Fed's balance sheet. But also, due to your bank being, used as an intermediary in that transaction by the Fed, there's $1 million of new bank money floating around in the system. And that is when the Fed created $3.5 or $4 trillion starting in March of 2020, it also, as a side effect of that, or really the primary effect of it, the collateral effect was a $3.5 or $4 trillion also in new bank money. There are two bank money circuits in the U.S., but the only one that really matters is the retail circuit, the bank money circuit. That's the one that counts. And before the Fed got going in March 2020, the retail bank money supply was about $13.5 trillion. And when it was all said and done, it was more like $18 trillion. And that's where your inflations come from. But that was all foreshadowed and all anticipated and all expressly called for by that going direct plan by BlackRock in August of 2019.
Yeah, and the Fed's supposed to be independent, right? And I saw congressional hearings where they're asking Powell about BlackRock, and he's like, they handle some of our accounts, and I mean that's like the exact opposite of what the Fed's supposed to be. They're supposed to be, independent of everything.
Well, when they say independent, what they mean, they're using it in the sense of the legal sense of independent agency means it's independent from the executive branch. When the Fed uses independent, what they're trying to say is we're independent of Congress. We don't answer to Congress, and that's a bunch of nonsense. The Fed was created by Congress. It's a creature of Congress. It could be shut down by Congress overnight. It could be audited by Congress. And that's what they mean by independence. But you're exactly right. They're not independent. They answer to BlackRock. I mean, they allow BlackRock to come in and to tell the Fed what assets to buy, including assets being sold by the Fed. So think about that. The Fed gins up, say, $1 billion of new money, and it's going to use that to buy a bond. And BlackRock's like, hey, we got a great bond for you to buy. It's a bond being sold by us. They were on both sides of those trades. And they got the Fed to sign a waiver saying that was okay. That wasn't a problem for BlackRock to line its own pocket with public money. So.
Yeah, I've also heard like economists try to say like reserves have nothing to do with inflation, but the way you're saying is the reserves are just creative accounting. All the banks just kind of get together and pass things off, and it just leads to more money printing in the end result.
I'll tell you an example where reserves, they don't create inflation, and it's really not a problem, and that is in the wake of the financial crisis. That crisis is really about bankrupt commercial banks. And what you can do in that case, and what the Fed actually did do, was it went to banks and said, say, let's use Citigroup. That's a good example because they were the most bankrupt of the big four. And so Citigroup might have a rotten mortgage-backed security sitting on its balance sheet. Let's say they paid $1 billion for it face, and it's now worthless because it's just infected with fraud. What the Fed did, it rode to the rescue and it said, we'll buy that bond for that mortgage-backed security from you we'll pay north of $1 billion. And when they pay for it with reserves, because the Citigroup, it transacts its business. It's not like us. It's a bank. To Citigroup, our bank money is no good. It's poison. It's a liability. To Citigroup and to other commercial banks, money is reserves. That's what they transact in. And in that case, because the reserves are just trapped in a closed circuit that includes the Fed is the issuer, it includes commercial banks, it includes foreign central banks, and a few other primary dealers are in there. It's a closed circuit, and the money doesn't leak out. And that's what people are trying to say. It's not a problem when the Fed creates reserves, but it's an incomplete statement because it's like, well, why did they create the reserves? Are they creating the reserves to buy the asset from a commercial bank, or are they creating reserves to buy assets from, say, I don't know, BlackRock? Because if it's the latter and BlackRock's not a bank, it's a financial institution, you are going to create inflation because that $1 billion of new reserves is going to force the parallel creation of $1 billion in new bank money. So people trotting that line out, typically they're either ignorant or they have an agenda, because it most certainly has created inflation as we've seen and as we're experiencing right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. So do you know of any other central bank in the world that has adopted the same or similar type of BlackRock plan as going to direct?
Yeah, all the Western central banks, they operate the same way, and I don't look at those other central banks with the same granular level of detail that I do with the Fed, but they all operate the same way. I did a video called, I think, Quantitative Easing is the Greatest Sham of All Time, or some such thing, and I walked through what I was telling you about how bank money is created in parallel with reserves. And one of the pieces of evidence I rely on is a publication by the Bank of England, which describes the mechanics of how quantitative easing works when you buy assets from a non-bank. So they all operate the same way. And the reason they operate the same way is that all really economies in the world, with precious few exceptions, have a debt-based monetary system meaning that money is created by banks when they lend, and that leaves your system where your so-called money, if it's really credit, is an IOU. Legally, it is an IOU, and that because of that, because of the legal nature of the banking system and the money in the banking system, as an IOU, you need a countervailing a countervailing system of electronic money, which is really like an IOME, and thus you need a second tier or a central bank so that transactions can be settled between two different commercial banks. And that's just how the system works around the world. And so all the banks really operate in the same way. And in modern times, they really operate in lockstep. They even the same, you'll see the same, propaganda campaigns. The EU, for example, is the ECB, European Central Bank, is fond of saying, well, we're independent. They parrot each other. So in other words, if one central bank is doing something, it's monkey see, monkey do in that world. They're all doing it. And the Fed is the ringleader because it's the world reserve currency.
Yeah. Yeah. You often see like the same type of policies and agendas, right? Like if the Fed's concentrated on green energy, they're all concentrated.
They're all doing ESG. Yeah, it's right. And they're doing it for some reason that's different from the reason that they're giving you. They don't really care about any kind of carbon footprint. They're flying around in private jets. They're trying to achieve some other objective. They're just not going to tell you what it is. And so they make up these marketing campaigns, and that's why they all sound like each other, because their lies have to be consistent with each other.
Yeah. Do you know anything about how the Fed could decide which pension funds are offered the Frankin money, for example? Is it based them having a large amount of something they'd like to buy, like treasury bills?
I don't know, because the Fed it's privately owned. In other words, there are 12. When you say the Federal Reserve, when it comes to money issuing, there are really 12 Federal Reserve banks. There's Bank of New York, Bank of Boston, Richmond, Atlanta, and then you go on out west, Chicago, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and so on. Those 12 banks make up the Fed, but those 12 district Federal Reserve banks are privately owned. And so there's no transparency into what they're really doing. They give you the illusion of transparency by setting up a board of governors saying, oh, well, the board of governors answers to the government, and you can go look at their disclosures and their forms and their website and all this other stuff. But what you're not going to see is the transaction level detail that will tell you what you want to know. Now, having said that, the New York Fed will release after 2 years the transaction level detail. But again, if you go look at that, and I was looking at it the other night, you'll see, well, who sold the Fed, these bonds and whatever. And if you go look, you'll see the same 24 names, which is the names of the primary dealers, because that's the only entities that the Fed will directly interact with are the primary dealers. Okay, so now what you've got to do, if you really want to know who sold the bond, you got to go to the people that the primary dealers dealt with. And you're not going to get the information from the Fed, from the district Feds. You're certainly not going to get it from the primary dealers. The primary dealers are all the usual suspects, and that they would have that information, and they're not going to disclose it. So I don't know how they decide, but you can rest assured it's a crony system, and you're not in it, and you're not going to be even granted the privilege of looking into and seeing who's doing what with how much money.
Yeah, and those smaller Fed banks, right? They're all shareholders, so it's the big banks that own shares. And is that correct?
That's another layer of opacity. You're exactly right. If you go and say, well, okay, the Fed is privately owned, who owns it? The answer is it's the commercial banks in that district, in the District of New York. And so then you say, okay, well, now who owns the banks? And then you go to their, proxy statements that they file with the SEC in connection with their annual statement, and you will see listed in the proxy statement the biggest shareholders are BlackRock and Vanguard and Fidelity. And then you ask who owns those, and it's an onion. It's an onion that turns in on itself. It's like a Mobius strip. You just keep going around and around and around in circles, and you never get anywhere.
I'm sure that's true with all the other central banks around the globe too. It's
the
same type of onion. Would you think that the Fed creating Frankin money in 2020 and not in 2008 is it because the tech is in place for a system reset, i.e., CBDCs and digital identity?
I think that's a big part of it. But the real question is, what's going on? Why now? Okay, why? Even assuming the premise of your question is correct and it is all about CBDCs and control, you still come back to the question of what is going on right now that is forcing their hand. And what I think it is that in the U.S., and I did a video on this called "Your Federal Reserve Cancer Prescription is Ready for Pickup," is that the U.S. is now in a situation where it's essentially borrowing to make the interest payment on the debt. Now, literally, that's not the case. Literally, what's the case is the Fed is borrowing money to make non-negotiable payments, which include interest on the debt, but also include Social Security payments, Medicare payments, Medicaid payments, and so on. Those sort of social contract things where historically the government has gone and said, when you're younger and you're healthy, you pay into the system. And when you get older and you don't have much as an income and you've already paid in all this money, you can now take money out of the system. The Fed can't really politically, or the Treasury either. Janet Yellen is not going to get up in front of a microphone and say, you know what, you guys are drawing too much money. We're going to cut your payments in half. Those payments are essentially non-negotiable. And when you look at the sum total of the non-negotiable payments in the U.S. budget, you'll see that it is now in excess of tax revenue, and that's ball game. That now means you have entrenched deficits, and you're going to see, and the last two annual Treasury reports, this is directly from the U.S. Treasury in the annual report, they show graphs showing the debt of the U.S. as a percentage of GDP literally going off the page like 700, 800% down decades down the road. And so the powers that be have got to rein that in somehow. Okay, so they can stop the debt-based monetary system and start issuing actual money like greenbacks, or they can find a way to try to cope with the rocketing debt. And one of the classic ways to cope with the debt is to inflate your way out of it. But another way would be if you could have a closed system, a closed retail system of money where you had really tight control over the money, you could simply delete people's bank accounts and delete money out of their accounts, and that would rein inflation in. But politically, that's not going to be a popular solution, obviously. But that's certainly one solution. Right now in the commercial banking system, there's something like 4,800 commercial banks. Very hard to control that. Much better to control it through CBDCs, under which system you wouldn't have 4,800 banks. You would have 12 issuing banks, i.e. the 12 district Federal Reserves. And I think that's why. So I think that your premise is right, that they're headed towards CBDC. But I think the reason is that the debt-based monetary system in the U.S., we sold off manufacturing. We got rid of that. Now we're in the casino phase of the zero-sum game, or the only engineering we have is financial engineering, where your loss means my gain and vice versa. That's only going to go on for so long as the Wall Street parasites take money out of the system. You've got to find a way to rein in that debt monster because it's going to kill you. And I think that's really what's driving all of this. Other people will tell you a different version of the same story, which is the debt's too high. Now you have so much debt that you don't have the collateral to match the debt. And they need a way to basically turn people into collateral, and they'll deal with the situation and deal with the system that way. But essentially, that's what it is. It's a debt-driven problem.
Yeah, and they could also control different sectors of the economy, right? If they control the money, they can condition the money and do all different types of things. I saw a pretty interesting seminar where they were talking about interest-bearing CBDCs, and they would say, since the Fed's issuing liabilities, they need assets to back it up. So that would make it possible for the Fed to go in and start buying everything, right? So to earn the interest on your CBDC, they would just need to have assets to back it, and mortgage-backed securities, stocks, everything would have to back it. So, it kind of give them the green light to pump up the markets.
Those assets are backing the Fed's issuance now. If you look at the Fed's balance sheet, you'll see, I don't know, $4.5 trillion of treasuries, $2.5 trillion of mortgage-backed securities. Those instruments are already on the Fed's balance sheet. What CBDC does, to my way of thinking, is rather than backing stuff with a U.S. bond or a massive mortgage-backed security, which is 5,000 mortgages, if you could have the people individually backing their own central bank digital currency. So if I had a central bank, if they put $1,000 in my account, that's, from the Fed's point of view, that's $1,000 liability. But what the CBDC might permit them to do is to collateralize that debt with me, and just say, well, instead of the IOU being from the U.S. government, the IOU is now from John Titus, and the IOU is now from Darren Moore, and so on. And that's the truly horrifying part of it, because if it's individualized, then you open up the system to, well, why don't we have credit default swaps taken out on individual people? We'll have people making bets on the success or failure of individual people or of groups of demographics, on a scale like that. That's not out of the realm of possibility. It's possible. And the thing to remember about Wall Street is, this is it's a criminally run enterprise, and has been for since at least as early as the global financial crisis. If it's possible, then they're going to do it. They're going to take as much thread as you give them. They're going to take every inch of rope that you give them.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't really think about that before. Just it's our credit that's backing the CBDCs, and that opens the possibility of like BlackRock shorting us or something.
Yeah,
we get out of line, they just short us and watch us drop.
Well, you saw there was a story the other day out of China where a bunch of people had their bank accounts frozen, and they were trying to get organized, and they were gonna travel, and they were going to launch a protest to people who had their bank accounts frozen. And China just reached out and just turned their health apps on their phone red. And turning red, it prevented them from transacting and prevented them from traveling. And that gives you an idea of the level of control that we're talking about once you have sort of a one-stop shop for your monetary system.
Yeah, pretty frightening. During the repo market crisis in fall 2019, 11 trillion in emergency loans were given by the Fed to the American and foreign banks. Is it clear to you whether the going direct plan was an anticipation of a crisis, or is there an argument to be made that the crisis may have been in part by design? Well, we kind of already covered that, right?
I think, well, that's a very good question, and it's interesting because the repo crisis, it started September 17th of 2019. And the Fed the $11 trillion figures is a little tricky because it's overnight loans, and they just keep re-upping overnight loans. So it's like going to the ATM machine and taking out $1,000, and you go back to the bank the next day and you deposit it, and you just keep doing that. And so the $11 trillion figures is a little tricky. If you go to the balance sheet of the Fed, you'll see that up until that time, starting in early 2018, the Fed actually started to taper down the. I've got a graph here. I'll just cut to it real quick so you can see what I'm talking about. I'll blow it up here. So that blue line you see there, okay, starting in about late 2017, the Fed starts tapering. It's the blue line, by the way, is liabilities on the Fed's balance sheet that are not physical cash. So it's electronic liabilities, it's digital money. And they start tapering down there, and then they get to August, and then you see September 2019, it reverses. The taper reverses, and they start increasing. That bump right there, all right, between the gray vertical line there is the pandemic. That's the repo crisis. That's not $11 trillion. That's more like, let's see, you got 2 trillion, then to 2.3, 2.4. It's a $300 to $400 trillion crisis. But that's really the repo crisis. And that's exactly right. That's really where the trouble began, was the Fed started tapering, and it ran into problems quickly because the system is addicted to free money from the Fed. And it's trying to wean the banks off the free drugs. They start to go into, shock. they start to have seizures, and then the Fed needs to come in and blast them with more money. So I think you did a video recently about Jamie Dimon and the mask coming off, and you sort of speculated, I think we'll maybe see some more QE. I think that's exactly right. I think the system's hooked now, and it's just a matter of time before the Fed runs into trouble trying to taper again, and we're back to QE. And it, just like before, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, my thought process is like, how bad does it get? Do they drop the ball completely and then overdo it again, or do they catch it in time? There's that timing mechanism behind it. Do they wipe out everyone's 401ks before they pump it back up again? It's like a 5-year process before you get back to the same prices of today. Also, the reverse repo too is kind of pointing to. Kind of pointed to today, right? Like the reverse repo was spiking before they even started raising interest rates.
Yes. And I think the reverse repo, I'm not as comfortable on that terrain, but the way I read that is it is a way, since the banks are sitting on a lot of what is to them cash, it's reserves. The Fed said, well, why don't you use some of your cash, commercial banks? Why don't you use some of your cash and put them into treasuries? And by engaging in reverse repo operations, what the Fed is doing, it is sort of ginning up demand for treasuries in a system that is already, way oversaturated with U.S. debt and with treasuries in particular. I think that's my read on it. It's a way for the Fed to provide support to the banks and also to find a way, an outlet, find a home for all these excess treasuries out there, because the U.S. is in so much debt.
Yeah, well, it also kind of points that they don't want to get into the bond market, right? They'd rather have the line with the Fed and get a little percentage overnight versus taking the risk of buying a bond that might dump the next day. And
you got it. Uncle Sugar is going to give you a better deal than that nasty free market is, which is not really all that free to begin with. But it's a lot. It's a much worse option than the sugar daddy at the Fed, for sure.
So you sent a FOIA request to the Feds. Is there any updates on the FOIA request?
Yeah, I should have done a video on this. I give the Fed a lot of grief. Okay, I really do. But I will tell you, they did answer the FOIA request. I really should do a video on it, and I can't tell you that the answer is complete, but they did produce documents in response to my FOIA request. I said, the FOIA request, just to sort of rewind the tape and set the table here, there was a transcript from the Fed. The Fed doesn't release transcripts until after 5 years, and nobody reads them because it's 5 years later and it's now ancient history. But if you read the transcripts, there was an interesting discussion in one of the transcripts where they say, if we issue Fed bills as a way to try to deal with the crisis here, we could issue Fed bills, but if we do, and I can't tell you I know what a Fed bill is, I'm just telling you what's in the transcript. If we issue these Fed bills, the problem is that our books will be consolidated with the books of the U.S. government. And the guy who says this is Jeffrey Lacquer from the Richmond Fed at the time, who later gets rolled over and basically evicted from the Fed 6 months before he's about to retire. And Lacquer says this out loud, and nobody ever comes back to that topic, ever. Okay, years go by, they never come back to the topic of Fed bills and consolidating the debt and consolidating the books, which is interesting because if you consolidate the books and the government's transparent, then we're going to get some transparency into the Fed books, and they don't want that. And that's why the topic vanished. So I sent a FOIA request to the Fed, and I said, hey, where Lacquer says the books gets consolidated? Give me all documents and all memos and emails referring or relating to that topic. And for sure enough, they coughed up some documents. They provided me, the way they do it is they'll send you links to their site, and you click on the links and the documents will say released as of, whenever they release it. It might have been May of 2020, something like that. May of 2021, I can't remember. But the documents are there. There are documents that are responsive to my FOIA request that they opened up. They opened up their books. That said, I'm convinced that they're not giving me everything, but I have no way of knowing whether or not their disclosure has been complete. I will say that they were very timely in responding to my emails, and that they did produce some documents. Yeah.
Are you going to pursue it further? Are you going to like try to dig in and like?
No, because there's no way I can only bite on what they give me. So like the lacquer thing where he says the books get consolidated. I know there's memos on that. Okay, there's gonna be emails and stuff, and sure enough, there were, but there's nothing in the documents that they produced in response to the FOIA request where they say, for example, hey, refer to spreadsheet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for a discussion of how we knew that the mortgage-backed securities were worthless and we bought them at par value anyway. There's nothing like that of that level of specificity where I can say to the Fed, I know that document exists, hand it over. That's what I'm looking for, and that's what's not there. So to answer your question, no, I don't have any plans to follow it up.
So central bank reserves no longer tied to gold and can issue money with impunity. Many of these digital assets speculated to become global bridges or settlement currencies, XRP, XLM, are hard capped. What do you think the result would be if they started using a hard cap digital asset as the settlement layer? Would this not be complete departure from the current debt-based monetary system?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes, it would represent a complete departure from the post-August 15th, 1971 monetary system, which is why it's not going to happen. They're not going to go to XRP. Now, that said, the Fed and other central banks, they might steal XRP's ideas, or they might get into bed with one of these companies and do it that way. But relinquish control, you're out of your mind if you think they're going to relinquish control. Let me tell you something about the 1971 monetary system. That's really when the Fed became all powerful. Right now, you have a system where there's really two issuers of money in the U.S. There's commercial banks, which create money when they lend, and there's the Fed, which creates money when it buys assets or when it basically does anything. They both create money. The difference is that the bank can't create as much money as it wants. And the reason is that if it creates, let's say the bank lends you $1 million, it creates that $1 million out of thin air. It's now exposed because you, Darren, can turn around and go to your bank and say, you know what, I'd like that $1 million in cash, meaning Federal Reserve notes. And commercial banks they don't print Federal Reserve notes. The Fed prints those. So now the bank they're exposed. So when the bank creates a $1 million account in your name, that's $1 million. That's a true liability because you can, demand notes, or you can transfer the money to another bank, which forces your commercial bank to come up with $1 million in reserves to transfer. So that's a true liability. The Fed, by contrast, after 1971, can freely create as many reserves as they want, and there's no restraint. Before 71, and this is what led to the gold window closing, foreign governments could say, I've got a $35 million in your money, in money that you issued, and you tell me that if the exchange rate is $35 an ounce, here's $35 million of your money. Where I want my million ounces of gold right now. That's what happened in August of 1971. And what happened? The gold window got closed. So today, since the gold windows are closed, nobody can demand redemption of Federal Reserve liabilities in anything other than Federal Reserve liabilities. Meaning you can go to the Fed now and say, hey, I got a $100 bill. I want to redeem this. It says note here. I want to redeem this. What you're going to get back is, 520s. You're going to get back something that the Fed freely creates itself anyway. So it's not really a liability. And that's really what gives the Fed power and dominion over the commercial banks. That's separate and apart from the fact that the Fed is the regulator of those banks. The Fed can just easily snap the neck of any bank and bankrupt any one of those banks, whereas nobody has that same power over the Fed. The Fed is the ultimate issuing authority in the U.S.
Yeah, that makes sense. My idea is that the central banks are going to issue on a lot of these just different public chains. Are going to issue their own, reserves or CBDCs directly onto the chain. And even if we think about something like the SDR, I mean, that
example.
perfectly issued on one of these protocols, and not to mention, like, it could be relative. So, the yen, the dollar, everything could be proportioned within that protocol. And then, XRP is kind of like the gas to make everything move on the protocol. You need a small amount, but the actual SDRs or whatever the assets are will be issued by the central banks. They just adopt somebody else's protocol. They don't have to do any of the technology work. It's just already out in the open and kind of withstood the test of time from a security standpoint.
That's funny you use the word gas in connection with XRP or in connection with the settlement currency. I think of them as sort of the secret or hidden lubrication or oil in the system. The reserves, enable the banking system to function, just as a settlement currency will enable different countries with different currencies to settle as between themselves. You don't really need that much, but you do need one. And I think the example of SDR, to be clear, that special drawing rights, it is issued by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and they're busy in that space. It's just a basket of different currencies. I think that's exactly how it's going to be done. But I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to skin that cat, and time will tell. But if I'm a betting man, I'm with you. I'd go with the SDR.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it just makes sense from everything that we've seen. I mean, just like the CEO of Ripple is at like IMF conferences and central bank conferences, right next to some of the people. If you go back and listen to some of the things that were being said, one of the questions was the IMF, will it ever adopt a crypto for the SDR? And the guy turns bright red in the face, and he just tries to avoid the question, and the CEO tapping him on the elbow and saying, maybe I should answer this. And it's there's something going on there. You can't really pinpoint it. It's a lot of speculation, but there's something.
That's funny. One of the things I do, one of the reasons I like doing videos is that nonverbal language, I'm a lawyer. I question witnesses. The nonverbal language is way more reliable than the verbal, right? It'll only tell you so much, but the nonverbal language, the body language, that, especially with these guys when they're lying, Ben Bernanke was probably one of the world's worst liars. You could just tell he couldn't make eye contact. He was terrible. It's always a nonverbal that gives them away. What you just said is a very significant observation about the IMF conference where they did that. That's unbelievable.
Yeah, I'll send you the video so you can watch and see if you're seeing something differently than we are. But there's definitely something there. So some speculate that there will be two systems of money after the Great Reset is complete. One that is hard cap deflationary for the elites, and one that is inflationary, surveilled, controlled CBDCs for the peasants. Do you think the creation of two systems of money like this is possible or probable? I don't see the elites will want to use CBDCs and not be able to hide any of their dirty business.
Another great question. There's a two-tiered monetary system now that exists. It's reserves for the top dogs, the central banks and the commercial banks. They transact all in reserves, and then there's the bank money system, which is issued by commercial banks. There's a two-tiered money system now. People talk about digital money like it's brand new. We have digital money now. If you look, there's only $2.3 trillion of cash in Federal Reserve notes in circulation in the world, whereas there's $18.5 trillion in bank money. We have a digital monetary system right now, and we have a digital two-tiered monetary system right now. The elites, I think, are totally content with that system because it's a great system of control. To the extent it's not a great system of control, it's because they have too many. There's 4,800, maybe 5,000 commercial banks just in the U.S. And it'd be much easier if you had far fewer, banks or issuers in that system. And I think they might like a system where either you have a two-tiered monetary system like you're talking about, where there's really, it's just one issuer working through intermediaries, or you'd have so the banks in that system would just kind of be like they are now. Or the second system would be, rather than banks being the intermediary, you might have tech companies be the intermediary. But I for sure the question is getting at the root of the truth, which is a two-tiered system. My big bugaboo is there's no rule of law, meaning the rule of law means everybody answers to the law. Nobody is, beyond the reach of the law, and nobody is under the law's protection. But the system we have now, pretty clearly, unless your head is in the sand, some people some people don't have to abide by the law. They just do whatever they want. They commit whatever crimes they want. We've got a two-tiered system now, and that's ultimately the problem, is we need a system where everybody is operating under the same rules and under the same monetary system, but we don't have that. And it's coming to a major head because the system we have now is one where a tiny fraction of the population can create money out of thin air and lend it to everybody else. That's fundamentally inconsistent with the rule of law, where the law is supposed to be supreme and everybody's supposed to answer to it. So I think absolutely you're going to see, in some shape or form, a two-tiered monetary system, because it would simply represent an extension of the system we have right now.
So what happened with crypto is, right, there's these law firms, Sullivan and Cromwell and Perkins Coie, that kind of drafted up what we want to see from regulations, and they kind of gave Hinman from the SEC a speech to read to kind of give the market clarity. And that's what the defense for XRP being a security is kind of relying on, was this market guidance or was this guy's personal opinion? But it was all drafted by Sullivan and Cromwell lawyers. So I just want to know if you have any thoughts on Sullivan and Cromwell and Perkins Coie, if any of your research has kind of pointed you in their direction at all.
Perkins Coie, not so much. That's a Seattle firm. I don't have much experience with them. Sullivan and Cromwell, I do, but I don't have experience with them in this area. I mean, in my own practice area. I do have experience with them in the sense of making videos for YouTube. I made a video called All the Plenary's Men, which gets into why bankers and why banks weren't prosecuted criminally, even when they admitted to committing crimes. And I'll give you an example. The example I used in that documentary, All the Plenary's Men, was HSBC, which admitted to violations of the Bank Secrecy Act, criminal violations of the Trading with the Enemies Act, all these things. Basically, they were helping drug dealers and terrorists launder money. And it was so bad, it was so egregious that there were prosecutors in Brooklyn who were like, let's get these guys, let's string them up, let's start prosecuting some of these bankers. And lo and behold, a guy from England, the head of the Exchequer, George Osborne, writes a memo basically to Ben Bernanke and to the Treasury Secretary at the time, and says to Geithner, and says, yeah, you need to back off, okay? Because if you prosecute, it could cause a real global problem, which is total nonsense, but that's what he was told. And all of a sudden, what you see in internal DOJ memos is a reversal of the team, which was originally going to let's get these guys, let's nail these guys, to we're not going to prosecute them, we're not going to do anything. We're going to enter into a deferred prosecution agreement. And the provisions of that deferred prosecution agreement were drafted by Sullivan and Cromwell. They were micromanaging the DOJ into how to implement the so-called penalty for HSBC, which paid something like a $1.9 billion penalty. I'll lay it all out there, but Sullivan and Cromwell is always knee-deep. It's a white shoe corporate criminal defense firm in Manhattan. It's been there a long time, well over 100 years. If something like that happens where people aren't getting prosecuted or something stinks to high heavens, and there's multiple billions of dollars involved, Sullivan and Cromwell's. You don't have to scratch the surface very hard to find Sullivan and Cromwell lurking beneath that surface. They're always there.
Yeah, I was digging into them, and they're involved with like a lot of coups in South America, as well as they're involved with like their reconstruction after World War II, and they're kind of involved with a lot of like shady underdealings, and not to mention like people from Sullivan and Cromwell go to different branches of the government, to the CIA, and then it's kind of like a boys' club where they all get together for dinners and stuff, and discuss things. So it's
Yeah, they're that's a connected outfit right there. And they've been connected for a long time. You go back, you read monetary history, you're going to run into Sullivan and Cromwell for sure. And they were they were involved. To my way of thinking, there was a coup in the U.S. To me, the coup happened with the bailout of 2008, where the banks. And they meant it, and they didn't. They said there'd be tanks in the street, there'd be Armageddon. They got what they wanted, and the takeover was complete. If you don't think Sullivan and Cromwell was knee deep in that, given their representation of all the major Wall Street banks and all the major commercial banks, you're out of your mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's do you have channels outside of YouTube where we could find you? Where can we find you to?
I have mirror channels, also called Best Evidence, on BitChute and on Odyssey. I'm I'm in the process of a physical move, and I'll start get back really into video making again. And I may release some that get me kicked off of YouTube. We'll see. Thus far, I've avoided the noose. We'll see how long that continues, but I do have backup channels on Odyssey and BitChute. Yes.
Okay. Are you on Twitter or anything?
No, nothing else. Social media to me, it's kind of poisonous. I never went for Facebook or Twitter. It's just, I don't like it. I just want to make videos. Really make videos. It's like a way for me. It's like therapy. It's a way to vent without anybody that I could see going, "You're crazy."
Yeah. That's a good way to have therapy, but and I agree with you with social media being poisonous. It's very like the whole app it's all addiction. It just hits all the addiction receptors, and you.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, exactly. It's all ego based. It's like, oh, I'm so invested in winning this. It's like, well, you're fighting over crumbs. Nothing.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, John. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you explaining some of the shady underdealings work.
Well, thanks for having me. I love your channel because I'm not a crypto guy, and I like your approach to your work. It's very granular, and I like also the way you listen to what people say. I had a mentor-in-law say 95% of people's problems are they don't listen. You actually listen to what they say and let them have their piece and go from there. And so anyway, I like your work, Darren. Thank you.
I appreciate that, John.